The overhead squat assessment is a bodyweight movement screen that can provide great insight into muscular deficiencies. As with all assessments, make sure the client understands the movement you are asking them to perform, but don't coach them through it. This is a chance to see how they move naturally. The arms are held overhead from start to finish. You'll be observing all 5 kinetic chain checkpoints from the anterior and lateral view. There's a lot to look for with this assessment, so let's break it down. Here we go. Set your client up for the overhead squat. Encourage a slower, controlled tempo. At the foot and ankle complex, you're looking for foot eversion or inversion. If the arches flatten, this is eversion. This compensation may indicate a lack of ankle dorsiflexion, potentially caused by overactive calf muscles and an underactive tibialis anterior and posterior. You'll also look for external or internal rotation of the tibia, foot turnout or pigeon toes. These compensations can also result from a lack of dorsiflexion. The feet turning out is the most common compensation. This may indicate overactive calves, tensor fasciae latae, or TFL, and biceps femoris with an underactive adductor complex. It's important to point out that the tibial internal rotators, the adductors, activate as a group. These include the gracilis, semitendinosus, semimembranosus, sartorius, and the medial gastrocnemius, to name a few. The next kinetic chain checkpoint is the knees. Understand that dysfunction at the knee can arise from ankle or hip dysfunction, or a combination of the both. So make sure you apply what you observe at the foot and ankle as well as the hip to get the whole picture. You may observe knee varus or valgus. Valgus, or the knees bowing in, is more common than knee varus. The muscles most likely to be overactive with knee valgus are the ones that externally rotate the tibia and internally rotate the femur. These include the TFL and iliotibial band, the IT band, the biceps femoris, the lateral gastrocnemius, glute minimus, and the adductors of the leg. The muscles that are likely underactive are the opposite, the tibial internal rotators and the external rotators of the femur. These include the gracilis, semitendinosus, semimembranosus, sartorius, medial gastrocnemius, vastus medialis, and the glute maximus and medius. If you observe knee varus, don't assume this is only a result of hip mobility issues. There are likely lower extremity issues that you'll need to rule out first. Knee varus may indicate overactivity of the lateral gastrocnemius, peroneals, piriformis, and biceps femoris. Muscles that may be underactive or inhibited include the glute maximus and medius, and the tibialis anterior and posterior. What you observe next at the hip can give more insight into the contributions of that musculature to the dysfunction. All right, so now we're at the hips. There are several things you should look for: forward lean, asymmetrical hip shift, and pelvic tilt. An excessive forward lean may indicate overactivity of the hip flexors and a lack of dorsiflexion at the ankles. Know that a lack of dorsiflexion at the ankles is the same as excessive plantar flexion. The muscles that control plantar flexion include the calf complex. The potentially overactive hip flexors include the TFL, psoas, iliacus, rectus femoris, sartorius, and anterior adductors of the leg. The underactive muscles that may be causing an excessive forward lean include the glute maximus, semitendinosus, semimembranosus, biceps femoris, adductor magnus, and anterior tibialis. A lateral view of the hips can uncover pelvic tilt. The hips can tilt anteriorly or posteriorly. An anterior pelvic tilt is the most common dysfunction you'll see. This causes lordosis of the lumbar spinal region, an excessive arch. If a client regularly complains of low back pain, this may be a dysfunction you expect to observe. It's a result of overactive hip flexors and lumbar extensors with underactive trunk flexors and hip extensors. Potential overactive muscles associated with an anterior pelvic tilt include the TFL, psoas, iliacus, sartorius, rectus femoris, erector spinae, and latissimus dorsi. The last two control lumbar spinal extension. Underactive muscles include the hip extensors, the glute maximus, semitendinosus, semimembranosus, biceps femoris, and adductor magnus. The underactive trunk muscles are those in the abdominal region. The rectus abdominis, internal and external obliques, and transverse abdominis. These muscles are sometimes called the anterior oblique subsystem collectively. From the anterior view, observations can be made for any asymmetrical hip shifting. Clients may not always shift toward their dominant side, and the observation may not always be very obvious. If left unaddressed, this type of dysfunction can lead to injury or strain to the groin, hamstrings, quadriceps, low back, or knees. With that in mind, don't forget to check for hip shift. Potential overactive muscles will be present on both sides of the body. The adductors and hip flexors on the same side of the hip shift, and the calves, piriformis, hamstrings, and glute medius on the opposite side. That means the potential underactive muscles for a hip shift are the adductors and hip flexors on the opposite side of the shift, and the calves, hamstrings, piriformis, and glute medius on the same side. The next checkpoint is the shoulders. You'll observe the thoracic spine here as well. You're looking for rounding that may indicate weakness through the upper back and overactivity in the chest. Individuals with known shoulder impingements or dysfunction will often have issues at this checkpoint during assessment. If the arms are falling forward, this is an internal rotation at the shoulders. This indicates that the latissimus dorsi, pectoralis major, and subscapularis may be overactive. The muscles that are most likely to be underactive are part of the rotator cuff, the infraspinatus, teres minor, and the posterior deltoid. If there is a kyphotic rounding of the thoracic spine observed, there may also be underactivity through the trapezius and rhomboids. At the shoulder checkpoint, you may also observe shoulder elevation. This can occur with or without the arms falling, but one may contribute to the other. If you see the shoulders elevate, it's unlikely you'll see rounding at the thoracic spine at the same time. Muscles can't be overactive and underactive simultaneously. If the shoulders elevate, the pectoralis minor, levator scapulae, rhomboids, and upper trapezius may be overactive. The underactive muscles are likely the serratus anterior and lower trapezius. Finally, you're up to the top, the head and neck. If you observe a forward head, overactive muscles may include the upper trapezius, levator scapulae, scalenes, and sternocleidomastoid. Potential underactive muscles include the cervical erector spinae, lower trapezius, rhomboids, and deep neck flexors. When you understand the musculature that causes a forward head, it's easy to see that if you observe this dysfunction, you'll probably observe shoulder elevation as well. The same muscles are overactive and inhibited. Whew. So that was a lot. And you're supposed to look at all of this in 5 to 15 repetitions. Don't worry. The more you do these assessments, the better and faster you'll get at spotting the dysfunction. Keep in mind, with the client's consent, you can take a video of the movement if you need more time to observe their movement patterns. Just don't get too hung up on the assessments. So long as you observe the major dysfunctions, you're off to a great start. As you train the client, you're likely to see additional movement dysfunctions you didn't initially catch. In that case, you can make a note of them and add them to your corrective strategy when appropriate.